Department official Jason Blazakis writes this week in the Washington Post, quote, "We must confront the real possibility that our next 9/11 could arrive from within." Joining me now are Olivia Troy, former White House Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor and Director of the Republican Accountability Project, and Clint Watts, former FBI Special Agent and MSNBC National Security Analyst. He's also the author of Messing with the Enemy. Thank you both very, very much for coming to the Sunday show. I want to start this conversation by playing sound from President George W. Bush's truly incredible speech yesterday in Shanksville.
We have seen growing evidence that the dangers to our country can come not only across borders, but from violence that gathers within. There is little cultural overlap between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home. But in their disdain for pluralism, in their disregard for human life, in their determination to defile national symbols, they are children of the same foul spirit, and it is our continuing duty to confront them.
You know, Olivia, President George W. Bush didn't name names, but I think we all know who he's talking about. Why do you think the American people take the threat of domestic terrorism, American people writ large, take it as seriously as the three of us on this screen do?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think it was very important for President Bush, former President Bush, to say, make that statement and say, really, I think he's pointing to the threat that lies within domestically and the rise of it that we are continuing to see and the great threat that it poses right now across our country. I think this threat has been familiar to many of us who work in the national security space, but I think it's becoming more and more prevalent as Americans start to see it in their communities as mass shootings, connected to domestic terrorism happen across our country. I think, we look at the U.S. Capitol, we see what happened on January 6th, but the reality is this is happening across the country. This can happen at state capitals. Some of these things have happened at state capitals, and there are some governors who have received domestic threats. We've seen that. And so I think, it's a mix out there, but I think the reality is that Americans, as we go along, are becoming more and more familiar about what's happening here.
And, Clint, I want to play what Hillary Rodham Clinton had to say on CBS on Friday about this very same topic, this threat of domestic terrorism.
We always have to be aware of and protect against external threats. But what really is tearing our country apart and threatening our democracy is what we saw on January 6th. And I, unfortunately, have seen so much of that kind of continuing divisiveness and hatred and ideological attitudes about our democracy, about each other. I think every American, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, should be as worried, if not more right now, about what we're doing to ourselves.
Right. And Clint, the question I have is, well, what can we do? We know that domestic terrorism is a grave threat, but what can we do to stop it?
So there are several things that we don't have for domestic terrorism that we did have for the international terrorism over the last 20 years. One is we developed an entire architecture that was focused on a defined group, or relatively defined group, I should say, Al-Qaeda, and then it spawned the Islamic State. So we had terrorist designation. That we just do not have in the domestic space, and it perplexes our ability because that brings up laws and procedures. Specifically, in the domestic space, we just don't have the ability to watch or look out onto social media to preemptively do investigations. And this has been the crux of the debate since January 6th of every committee hearing, I think, is what are Americans, willing to let American law enforcement do to protect them? It's just not very clear. Separately, this is empowered by political leaders. Just like during the Al-Qaeda ISIS era, we looked at people like bin Laden. He wasn't a fighter, he was an inspirer. Anwar al-Awlaki, an American cleric, Yemeni American cleric, he was an inspirer. We have that today, except it's our elected officials. It's our political leaders that are doing this for the domestic extremist scene. what you see right there, President Trump told them they were going to the Capitol that day. They didn't pick the Capitol. He said it. His organizers, they promoted it. His fellow congressmen in the GOP, they promoted it. It was Josh Hawley out there fist bumping the crowd right before it went in. That's the kind of thing that we look for to see, hey, where are they tipping to? Where are they pointing to? For the most part, the groups aren't picking the targets. It's the elected leaders and those that inspire them to do.
And, you know, Olivia, that is a nice segue to the question that I was teeing up for you on this piece of paper here, and that is, what is the responsibility of the Republican Party? This is not a question of, you know, both sides. No, this is the Republican Party and leaders within the Republican Party who, in the hours after the insurrection, saying this was bad and Trump was responsible. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. To now doing everything possible to not only pretend that it didn't happen, but to stand in the way of even investigating what happened. And as we saw on the screen, nothing breaks my heart more than to see the Capitol being overrun by domestic terrorists carrying Trump signs.
Yeah, those images are horrifying. I think they're still horrifying today, no matter how many times we see them. I can never get used to seeing what happened that day and watching many get attacked in law enforcement. But the reality is, what the Republican Party can do today, these leaders, people like Kevin McCarthy, who are, you know, front and center, is to start telling the truth. Start telling these supporters of yours. Start telling Americans, the people that you want voting for you, the people that you are so greedy in terms of maintaining your power and your quest for power. It's your responsibility to tell the truth about what led to January 6th. Tell the truth about the threats that are on the rise across our country, because you are complicit in enabling and emboldening these threats by the lies that you have told Americans across the country who listen to you. And this is people who are like, you know, Representative Gosar and Gomert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't see any difference between McCarthy and some of these other people where he may try to distance himself at times. You are all responsible together for what's happening here. And you need to start telling people the truth, because they are the voices that need to be heard by the people who are looking at them and following their leadership and their actions when it comes to this threat. And
Clint, we're out of time, but I need to ask you this question real quickly. How fearful are you that we could see another January 6th or some sort of far-right extremist-inspired domestic terrorist attack here at home?
It would be my top worry. I'm not so much worried about September 18th. I'm more worried about the lone wolf, most extreme actor or a small cell of actors in the domestic extremist space. Think more like a Timothy McVeigh, except I tell you today, there are 100 McVeighs out there that are thinking about a bombing or thinking about an attack, and it's a much more dangerous landscape than any time in the last several decades.
And that last point, Clint, is the thing that gives me the most worry. Clint Watts, Olivia Troy, thank you both so much for coming to the Sunday show. Coming up, my all-star panel is here, and we'll sound off about everything from vaccine mandates to the California recall, and even why it looks like Trump, to the angst